Let us begin by taking a look at some of the basic functionalities of the while loop. A while loop is a control flow statement that allows a block of the subdiagram code to be executed repeatedly until a given Boolean condition is met. Unlike the for loop, a while loop does not have a set iteration count. Thus, a while loop will execute indefinitely if the condition never occurs. First, the code within the subdiagram is executed. Then, the conditional terminal is evaluated. If the specified condition is not met, the while loop will repeat itself. When the condition is met, the loop ends. While loops will execute until the conditional terminal receives a specified Boolean value of 1 or 0. The required value is determined by the state of the conditional terminal. There are two settings for the conditional terminal: stop if true and continue if true. When set to stop if true, a Boolean value of true will force the loop to halt execution. When set to continue if true, the while loop will run only if a Boolean value of true is sent to the terminal. The iteration terminal contains the number of completed iterations. The iteration count will always start at 0. Structure tunnels are used to feed data into and out of while loops. A structure tunnel feeding data into the while loop will send data in on the first iteration of the loop. Data flowing out of the while loop will flow only at the termination of the while loop. Now, we will go over how to create a while loop, use structure tunnels, and also perform basic error handling with the while loop. Let's create a while loop. Begin by opening a new VI. Switch to the block diagram by pressing Ctrl E. If the functions palette is not available, right-click on the blank space to bring up the functions palette. Let's add some code that we want to repeat. Select the random number generator from the mathematics palette and drag it onto the block diagram. Right-click on the outputs terminal, create indicator to create an indicator for our random number. Now, click Programming Palette, Structures to go to the while loop. With the while loop selected, drag a selection around the code we want to repeat. Switch to the front panel and create a stop Boolean. The stop button will dictate when our while loop will stop execution. To do so, drag the stop button inside the while loop and wire the stop Boolean into the conditional terminal. We have just finished creating the while loop that will display a random number with each iteration. Now, let's pass data from the while loop outside using a structure tunnel. Create a numeric indicator on the front panel. Name the numeric indicator iteration count. On the block diagram, drag the iteration count numeric indicator to outside of the while loop. Drag a data wire from the iteration counter into the border of the while loop to create a structure tunnel. The color of the structure tunnel is determined by the data type wired to the tunnel. Complete the structure tunnel by dragging a data wire from the structure tunnel into the numeric indicator to pass the number of iterations to our display. Now let's create a simple error handler. Place an error in 3D control on the front panel. This can be found under the Arrays, Matrix, and Clusters palette. Switch to the block diagram. Move the error in control to the left of the while loop to simulate an error coming in into the while loop. Next, on the Functions palette, Dialogues palette, create a simple error handler. This error handler will display to us any error that has occurred during the execution of the program. Link the error in control with the simple error handler using structure tunnels. Separate the Boolean portion of the error wire using an unbundle by name function. The unbundle by name function can be found under the clusters class and variant palette. Wire the error wire into the unbundle by name function to separate the Boolean portion of the error. Next, remove the link between the stop button and the conditional terminal. Add an OR function onto the block diagram inside the while loop. Link the stop button along with the Boolean portion of the error into the OR function and proceed to link the output of the OR function into the conditional terminal. Now, the while loop will stop execution if an error is detected or if the stop button is pushed. Let's take a look at some of the basic functionalities of the for loop. Like the while loop, a for loop is a control flow statement. It allows a block of the sub-diagram code to execute a set number of times. A for loop differs from a while loop in that a for loop executes a set number of times, and a while loop stops executing the sub-diagram only if the value at the conditional terminal exists. In a for loop, with each iteration, the current iteration number is compared with the preset count number for the loop. If current iteration number has reached the preset count number, the loop will halt execution. Otherwise, the code is executed and the current execution number is incremented by 1. The count terminal of the for loop determines the number of iterations in the for loop. It is required that the count terminal be wired to an integer value. The iteration terminal contains the number of completed iterations. Like the while loop, the iteration count always starts at 0. Next, we will go over some examples on how to create a for loop and also how to add a conditional terminal to a for loop. Now, let's create a for loop. Begin by opening a blank VI. On the block diagram, let's create a random number generator. On the functions palette, under mathematics, numeric, random number generator, drag the function out onto the block diagram. Right-click on the outlet, create indicator to create an indicator that will display the random number. Back on the functions palette, if we go to programming, functions structures, we'll be able to find this for loop. Drag the for loop around the area of code you want to repeat, and a for loop is created. On the top left corner is the loop count. Right-click on it to create a constant that will link up with the loop count. This number dictates the number of iterations the for loop will go through. Enter 100 to have the for loop execute 100 times before it stops execution. To add a conditional terminal, right-click on the for loop and select Conditional Terminal. We can add a stop button to the conditional terminal by right-clicking on it and creating a control. Now, our for loop is going to execute 100 times before stopping or when we press the stop button.